Good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for Prof. William Gumede to join us. It's lovely to be with you again. Hi, Prof. It's lovely to be with you all again to have this really important discussion on institutions and their role in constitutional democracies. We really are blessed with a lovely panel this morning. Prof. Pierre de Vos, Professor of Constitutional Law at UCT, and Professor William Gumede, an associate professor at the Wits School of Government, also well-known author, and both people, hope you don't mind the term, are leading public intellectuals in South Africa who set the tempo on many of our key debates. So really happy to be with you. And Prof. Pierre de Vos, I thought we may start with you as we begin our second in the series of webinars with the Inclusive Society to honor that wonderful judge, Albie Sachs, who turned 90 this year, and to ask you, as somebody who watches the Constitutional Court so closely, that being the gem in our crown in South Africa, how is our court doing as an institution, and where do you place it as protecting our democracy? How has it done so? Big question, I know.
Yeah. But it's the question could be answered differently depending on what you're thinking about. If you look at how the court is functioning, I think it's in trouble. I had a quick look at their website. Also, the website is not up to date. You can't find the material, but there's cases outstanding going back to March, having been heard March last year, May last year, June. The impeachment judgments about the parliament rejecting the expert report on President Ramaphosa and Phala heard in November. There's no judgment. So it's supposed to be within 3 or 6 months. And so there's something going on there, perhaps having to do with the number of applications that stream into the court. It has gone up exponentially almost. But there might be other issues. On the other side, on the quality of the judgments, I get the impression, and I see some columnists wrote the same thing a few weeks ago, I think on News 24, that the quality of the judgment may be getting better. There was a wobbly period where some of the judgments really were not very good. There were some reactionary judgments, xenophobic judgments in one case, I believe. Judgments would come out and the text in the main part of the judgment was different from the order given at the end, so it's basic mistakes. But I think it's been getting better again. And of course, compared to most courts, highest courts in most parts of the world, what our court is doing is actually quite remarkable. It is, for better or for worse, a major political player, political in the bigger sense. And it's usually on the side of justice, on the side of those who need the protection or intervention of the law, not always, but mostly, and therefore more progressive than one would expect courts to be. Law is a conservative discipline. Judges are by nature conservative. So for the moment, I'm much more optimistic about the court than I've been for a while, and I'm really glad that we have such an institution in South Africa.
That's really excellent to hear. Can I ask, though, to where you started with the length of time it's taking for judgments to come out far beyond what the expected norm is of 3 to 6 months? Is that a function of the change of Chief Justice, a new person settling in, quite a few changes to the bench coming up, or do you see these as structural weaknesses which you've been watching for a while now?
No, it's been coming for a while. It's gotten worse and worse. One of the reasons is that in 2009 or 10, there was a constitutional amendment that broadened the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court. They can now hear not only cases dealing with constitutional or related matters, but any matter of of general public concern about that raises a controversial or disputed legal issue. And so the court has been thrown in, they've been thrown or inundated by applications. The court as a whole must decide every application, are we going to hear this or not? So somebody must read all of those things. So that's one reason. Another reason, I think, is that some of the judges who were appointed during the Zuma years were less energetic and diligent than other judges. And so some people, they just take forever to write the judgment. It is, some people are lazy and they don't do the work. I'm not going to name names, but I think there are a few of those judges.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, not in a million years am I going to say. But and it's I mean, but some of it also I think has to do with the loss of the collegiality. It used to be 11 judges, but they sometimes really disagreed. But they worked as a team. The judges on different sides of a matter would actually help the other side with the formulation and the checking and the editing. In the Mogoeng years, I think that largely got lost. And I don't know, I don't have a sense yet if Chief Justice Meyer has been making a difference in that regard.
That's really, thank you for your insights. And what about you, Prof. William Gumede? What's your view of our Constitutional Court? Because for me, I'd always felt, even through all the years of capture, that was our bulwark, you know, the protector, the grand guardian of South Africa's democracy and obviously of its constitution. How do you see its performance?
Thank you for being with you again in this conversation. I think the first thing I just wanted to say as a precursor, for me, there are two kinds of institutions supporting our democracy. Of course, it's the direct ones, Constitutional Court, Public Protector, Auditor General, and so on. And for me, there are more indirect ones. For example, I'm increasingly beginning to think that the public service, for example, is a key institution supporting our democracy. Now, the thing about, as Pierre and I just explained around the Constitutional Court, when the institutions that support democracy are not working, it then undermines the quality of democracy, and people's perception of democracy is then negative, because how do people experience democracy? Through its institutions, through the public service delivering or not delivering. That's how people experience of democracy. So it's very, very important that the institutions of democracy is strong. Coming back directly to the Constitutional Court, I think it is one of our great institutions. For me, the last 30 years, it almost stands alone as one of the institutions that we can be proud of. And for me, the second ones, last year I got to work with them a little bit more, is the Independent Electoral Commission. They've been under great pressure because we are in a whole new dimension of politics, coalition politics. And so on. So for me, the Constitutional Court and the IEC, for me, stands at the top end of our institutions. But just coming back to two things about that Pierre was saying is the capacity. We think about institutions, the way they work. If they don't have the capacity, then we get the delays, like in the Constitutional Court. It's almost, institutions have a public service, their own little public services. So if the capacity is not there, it's not proper there. And the second thing, many of our institutions actually, over time, what happened is that, like the Constitutional Court, they have to do extra things that they were not designed before. And then often they don't then get their extra capacity and the extra finances. So, almost like a technical reason for not delivering.
And Pierre, just to many things I want to tease out there, but one thing I have noticed is political battles of the polity of the public square increasingly end up before the courts. do they also end up petition? As in some cases, yes, many key cases, a direct petition to the Constitutional Court. Is that perhaps also jamming up the efficacy of the Con Court just because judges are so busy with so many applications?
Yes, I think all those lawyers who advise their clients to go directly to the Constitutional Court should be fired. It almost never works unless it is an earth-shattering life and death issue for the country. The court wouldn't hear it, so the lawyers are not doing their job. These cases are not so, but despite that, not many people have the money to actually do this. So I don't think it plays a huge role, and the court can, of course, refuse. Sometimes they make more work for themselves than they needed to, like with the appointment of the acting minister, which the president said actually just didn't mean acting, he meant real, but maybe only for a while. Because they decided to hear the case, and very speedily it's clearly, and then they decided, well, we shouldn't hear the case at all. I thought it was quite bizarre. But the bigger problem is that maybe that is to do not so much with the court being flooded. It is that the legal system and the court, that its legitimacy comes under strain when the political battles are framed as legal battles and then go to the court, and then the court inevitably gets entangled in political fights, party political fights, if you will. The law is to some extent always political, but that kind of contestation, of political contestation, and this really, if it could really weaken the court, the whole judiciary. It gives opening for the populists and the charlatans to discredit the courts, and they will use it, and they are using it. So in a way, this worries me. I understand why this happens, because the political process seems also dysfunctional. Until recently, it looked like one party always wins the election and decides at national level what happens. So people try for other ways of getting the voices heard, but it could create problems in the long term. It changes it. The other thing is also changes the mindset. So people, instead of doing politics, they go to the court. So citizen activism and all those things, it depoliticizes the citizenry. It enriches, of course, the lawyers.
I must say, I'm watching a lot of that from local level, provincial and national level. And it's not only between parties or between parties and the IEC, it's intra-party as well. They're fighting their battles in the courts and generally. So both of you have said that the public service is a vital institution. And Pierre, I wonder if you can pick that up for us. Do you mean the public service as a whole or the Public Service Commission? And could you share why?
Yeah, so the Public Service Commission is too boring for me to know much about. What the hell do they do? I mean more the public service, in the sense that the people who actually has to do the work and implement the policies. I would go, maybe technically, I don't know if that's correct, but from the public service at the municipality to the province to the national. And it is a catastrophe, in the sense people say it's because of cadre deployment. I think that's misstating the problem there. It's not cadre deployment as such. It is nepotism and corruption in the appointment of people that completely then decapacitates, in those management speak words, the public service. And that then means that pensioners might not get their pension. If you go to the Home Affairs, the system is offline. You go to the hospital, they've run out of bandages. It's because the whole system is not working, because of the capturing in a very mundane way of the system and the appointments processes. That is needed, of course, because the people who sit on tender boards need to be your people so that they can cheat the system. And it's necessary because people need to give patronage. And so they use this to give patronage, and it's to catastrophic effect for ordinary people who actually rely on the state, not upper middle class people like us who do not always have to rely on the state, but people who really need it. So I don't understand why there's not a revolution about the fact that the public service is not working, and why that people are not appointed who actually needs to know what they're doing to make sure the water comes out of the tap, the electricity comes down the socket or whatever.
Thank you. So, I've just, William, I was telling you, just come back from a trip to China. And to be honest, I was quite blown away by the state of infrastructure, by how everything works, by how the city's clean, how there's been this mass migration, and it's largely I guess, your public service, civil service that has enabled the systems that have meant 800 million people have been lifted out of absolute poverty into what we would call the low middle classes. And I have checked those numbers. They are World Bank. Everyone has agreed with those numbers. Yeah, we could have seen exactly the same trajectory. And I'm guessing from what Pierre says, it's because we have never got this independent administrative political interface right. Is that something you agree with? And do you see changes happening that are good ones?
No, absolutely. I agree with you fully. I mean, I was on, for example, on the inquiry, President Ramaphosa's inquiry on the professionalization of the public service. So 2 years ago, we worked for about 18 months on it. And really, I mean, we missed a golden opportunity to make the public service competent, because you can only make the public service competent if it's merit-based. Unfortunately, there's no other way to do it. And the moment that cadre deployment was introduced, that was the end of the public service. And and it's across the world. I mean, since the end of colonialism in Africa, cadre deployment had been introduced into the public services, and that is always the end, and that's one of the reasons why societies fail, and one of the reasons why democracy fail is because the public service is not delivering. It doesn't have the capacity. So our democratic institutions that support democracy fail or are perceived to fail because the public service are not supporting them in execution. I mean, going back to China and your example, I mean, I was also amazed when I went to China. I mean, it stunned how the public service, the efficiency of the public service. And one of the things that the Chinese did was to bring in merit-based in their public service. So what they've done, they've depoliticize the public service. So you don't need to be a party member to be in the public service. For example, if you want to enter their public service, every year, only the top people, you write an exam and only the top people get into the public service. Think about the equivalent of our matric system, where, the top 100 people with the A's and so on, only they can go into the public service. That's how they transform their public service. Of course, the same in Japan. They learned that from Japan, and South Korea and Singapore did that also. And they turned around their countries also, because if you have a solid public service that is competent, that is isolated from any of the political parties, it really makes the big difference. And it is I mean, it has been for me so hard to explain it to political parties and to politicians that unless we get their competency, and the competency we can only get there if it's beyond color, and it's only on competence. It's like a price that we have to pay to get the competency there, even if the color mix is not right, in order to get the delivery, to get the jobs, to get the growth, and get the government to function.
And have you, I mean, I know you all put forward various recommendations. There is a piece of law, the Public Service, I think, Amendment Bill, which aims to end the era of absolute cadre deployment, introduce skills and qualifications as key measures, especially in the senior levels of the public service. Where is that piece of law? Last time I heard there were efforts to get it turned around at Parliament, but it's back on track now from what I hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the parliamentary process, unfortunately, it takes as well. It's almost like what you say, the constitutional court, well, just worse than the constitutional court. I mean, it's a it's a very long process. But sometimes, it is. It's not laws that are important. Yes, laws are important, but we need to change the culture. If we can get the culture right of the public service, and the culture starts with the competency, we don't need a law to do that. Of course, well, we're now forced to get a law through Parliament to enforce it. It's like Pierre was saying earlier on, why we've stuck with the Constitutional Court and other courts, because people take political things because we don't have the maturity of the politicians, and the politicians don't act in the public interest and so on. People have no other choice but going to the courts or going through very long processes through Parliament to change things. While if there was the maturity, we could have just dealt with it by changing the culture, by, for example, just appointing people on merit like today, and holding people accountable, and not going to courts or long processes in Parliament for that.
And Pierre, you live in the Western Cape and in Cape Town, I think, unless you've moved to
I'm looking
somewhere
out on the mountain, yeah.
right now. So the DA always says that it has implemented merit-based appointments.
Yeah.
It takes the case of where a former ANC activist, I think, is the Department of Health. It says it chooses the best people. Do you see that, firstly? And secondly, is there a palpable impact in how services are delivered to people that's different than, say, Limpopo or my present bugbear, the Northwest, which really seems like a complete failed state?
Yes. So obviously, I don't know exactly how people are appointed. I have been surprised to encounter somebody that I say met at some NGO social justice event, and then they're working for the Western Cape government. It's like, oh my God, I thought you were EFF kind of person. So that happens. There is definitely less of the you have to be our party. I'm sure there's also cadre deployment of some sort or another. My personal experience is, of course, there's all the problems of inequality, the fact that the city and the province have not always done what they needed to do to try and address that. The new mayor has now a budget here that will charge us middle-class people much more to try and do more of that. Of course, all the property developers are up in arms. So I don't know where will that end. But for me, as somebody living in Cape Town in a middle-class area, it is completely incomparable to Johannesburg. My electricity stopped working. I didn't realize I didn't have credits in my box. I called the electricity department, and 20 minutes later, they were there and told me,
Wait. 20 minutes. You
20
called and
minutes.
20 minutes later they were there.
This is like, I can't
William,
believe it. I was going to go to the shop, and there they were at my door phoning, so with a cell phone saying, we are here. This is impossible. My former partner emailed the city councillor to say the bench needs new slats. 2 weeks later, that it was fixed. Now, I'm sure this doesn't happen if you live in a poorer area, because the services are unequal. They are unequally provided and less efficient in one area than another. And of course, then there's also just the difficulties that comes with living in an area where the crime rate is very high. But I have no doubt that it's better, more efficient system. And some of it has to do with appointing people, whether they are DA supporters or not, I don't know, but appointing people with the skills to do the job.
When my friend Adrian Basson, who all of us will know, when he moved to Cape Town, he told me there was a pothole outside his house. So he called and he was totally amazed when an hour later there was a team out to fix it. William, I've tried in Joburg. How long does it take? Hours or days, anyway. So we have some lacquer questions. So first one to Pierre from Kazimulo and Globo asked, how is it possible for political parties to use the courts as their battleground? Surely that hampers on other more pressing needs of the country. And then for you, William, from Jamie Benjamin, are there lessons from other democracies that South Africa could learn from in strengthening institutional support for constitutional values? I suppose I just because I've been to China, but it's not a democracy, and I think that's part of why it works. So we can get to that. So you first, Prof.
So you mean me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Sorry, both
okay.
Prof. Yeah.
I wanted to make that point, William, so that, yeah. But in any case, it's a funny thing why this is possible. Most of these, we have a supreme constitution. So if the constitution is breached, you can take it to court. If you have money, you can take it to court. And of course, one thinks, oh, this is when there's an infringement of somebody's rights. But what happened in South Africa, the Constitutional Court in the early years, they said, well, every exercise of public power, so whether it is the minister, it's the director general, it's the official in the licensing department, every exercise of public power is reviewable under the legality principle. So in other words, it needs to be authorized by law. You can review it if you are not authorized to do what you did. It needs to be rational. And so most of these cases are rationality review cases, kind of rule of law. It's a rule of law argument. And people use that now all the time to go to the court. And because of the Zuma years, maybe that rationality principle was kind of stretched to be a little bit more broad, more effective in setting aside public exercise of public power. So it's slightly easier to win under the rationality principle than it was in 20 years ago. And so all of these things, and given that the lawyers have also gotten on, and the politicians, the political parties have money, this happens then that things end up in the Constitutional Court.
Thank you. Prof. William, what are there lessons from other democracies that we could learn from?
Yeah. Maybe just the first thing, just to respond to Pierre also, just to say that, we are, because we are a constitutional democracy, we shouldn't panic if people go to the Constitutional Court or to the courts to resolve even political issues. Actually, it should be normal in our constitutional democracy and so on. Obviously, we are concerned if, there are some people who abuse the processes. We've seen it during the Jacob Zuma years. But also, secondly, there's some people who just attack the democratic institutions, sadly, because although we've got a constitutional court, there are people and very prominent people in the country who do not believe, firstly, in the constitution or the constitutional court or in democracy. So we almost have a competition to the constitution itself, and we haven't dealt with that at all. So there are people who are either deliberately want to attack the legitimacy of democratic institutions, and there's others just who do not believe it. And then also because we've had general lack of rule of law, the computing governance systems to the constitution, run as if it's legitimate. I mean, just for example, in the rural areas, there will be customary law. It's a law on its own. It's almost as if the constitution doesn't exist. We've seen it more recently with the taxi mafias, for example. They're a law on its own. You think that we've got a constitution and we've got courts and so on. They can just do whatever they want. So almost there is these sort of pockets of unconstitutionality. They continue as if it's normal. Now, how do we support? What can we do to support our democratic institutions? Now, supporting, firstly, is we are setting our country, we don't have as yet a democratic culture. What do I mean by a democratic culture? All countries have cultures, sort of political cultures, where people respect the rule of law, people take the decisions um, of institutions as credible, and so on. We, unfortunately, we're not there, so we have to become a country where we foster a democratic culture, accepting the rule of law, for example. Now, how do we do that? Can we get it in our families, in our schools, in our workplaces? Almost that kind of mass training. Can we, for example, I mean, I'm starting to begin to think that if you go to university, or if you go to school, or if you go to nursery school, you have to learn about the Constitution, and you have to learn how to behave as a democratic citizen. It has to be learned, because we're not naturally Democrats, and we also come from political cultures of the past that were anti-democratic. So it's a learning process, and for me, it is a very important learning process that we have to do it actively.
So, but may I come back at you for a moment, and perhaps Pierre, you also want to come in? Is I find us to be profoundly democratic in our culture. And I suppose it's on the other side of things where we speak up, we speak out, and we challenge. And our constitution has built in rights for the most vulnerable and for the people who are being cast to the outer edges in the world today. And so I'm thinking of migrants' rights. I'm thinking of the rights of LGBTIQ people, where you see images of hate in so many countries on our continent and in the world. Look at what Trump's doing to transgendered people. Here in South Africa, these are accepted and all the time expansionary rights. So I don't know, Pierre, do you agree that we lack a democratic culture?
Um, I I think you are right that there is the formal legal respect for difference, for plurality, is remarkable. We are really up there with the best. The fact that people can have their say and do have their say and demand to have their rights recognized, very so. I find that people are very good at recognizing rights for themselves. They are not always so good at recognizing rights for people they disagree with. So it's a kind of intolerance. It's a kind of um, uh, it's a kind of sharp the sharp disagreements that are about more than disagreements that turn into or are presented and exploited by populist politicians as life and death struggles. Of course, some of that is also understandable because of the obscene inequality and the chasing of resources. So some people who say it's life and death might actually have a point, but we don't have a genteel culture where, oh, I lost the election. Well, it's terrible, but now you govern. People will fight. They're going to the MK party is going to the electoral court, and they are making all kinds of preposterous claims that their own papers do not support. Because that's the culture. It's not like, oh, we'll respect the will of the people. That's the aim of that. So I'm sitting between you and William in the
You
sense that
got
I
it.
don't think I'm sitting on the fence. I don't think one can say there's no democratic culture. But in the sense of a genteel acceptance of difference and diversity and let everybody live and flourish, I'm not sure that is always the case.
Good, got you.
Perhaps, Ferial, if I could perhaps just quickly
Yes,
come
please.
on. It's just in terms of responsibilities. People are very happy to exercise their right to protest and their right to disagree. But the issue is there are two things that makes a democratic culture. One is, how you behave, your democratic responsibility, and how do you behave in relation to other people? Do you respect other people, and so on? Do you litter your environment? Do you make a noise, knowing deliberate, that it undermines other people or your consideration? That's part of democratic culture. In fact, that's an absolutely important part of the democratic culture. But not only that, even in the absence of, let's just say, if we want to to get the things we want in a country, we want economic growth, we want prosperity for all, we want to deal with poverty, but we won't be able to do it unless we get a culture of responsibility, democratic responsibility. Every individual has to be responsible, and that is often not seen. For example, a lot of people went a couple of years ago, a big debate in South Africa and in the ANC was about the developmental state in Japan and Singapore, and they all done very, very well. But obviously, one was the intelligence of the state. When I say intelligence of the state, was the capacity of the state and so on, and good policies. But the other part, which was I think is as important, is the responsibilities of individuals and citizens. So so you can't get the growth and the poverty reduction unless you also get some kind of discipline, the discipline of responsibilities by individuals. Where, to behave good when nobody watches you is a very, very important part of democratic culture. But not only democracy, but it's also to get the economic growth and to get everything. People need to follow the rules when nobody watches. And that makes the society and that makes the democratic culture. And the societies that gone that route, that have developed since the Second World War, there was that element of responsibility at the individual level of behaving well was an important part of the transformation of those societies.
That's interesting, and this is just a comment. Is that I learned those values from what today is the ANC, what then would have been the mass democratic movement. You learn responsibilities and democratic praxis, and yet now I'm reading up on the ANC's role in construction mafias. Is that it's no longer providing that society leadership. So if I'm looking as where does it come from? It comes from institutions. So I want to move to a question from Talia Kincaid. And so state capture really lobbed grenades at almost every single one of the institutions we've spoken about and the ones we're still going to speak about. Mm-hmm. While we often personalize state capture to the story of the Guptas, President Zuma, Salim Issa, in fact, it was the institutional attacks which put us where we are today. And maybe to start with you, Pierre, I see us as now being in an era of what I call the fixes, where these institutions have changed hands, and you see people trying their level best to fix them. How far do you think we are in that journey when you take a look at the NPA, at Eskom, at various of the institutions which were attacked?
Yes, I find the framing of state capture maybe not helpful in the sense that it creates a story that there was this time when these people came, they captured the state and milked us dry, and then they left.
And then they sold the mansion
to Kandla or Dubai. While that happened, all of that happened, and maybe it's not happening anymore, but it doesn't mean that the corruption, that capture of individual institutions to extract resources from state institutions, whether that has gone down, I think it's increased. As if we look at the amount of money, I haven't seen a research report on this, but my feeling is, my guess from what I read, what I see, is that it is absolutely endemic. And the irony is perhaps that from the outside, at least, I really don't know what is going on in Eskom and PRASA and so on. But from the outside, these flagship institutions have perhaps might have been partly uncaptured the top leadership, the boards have been replaced and the top leadership. And so there's a turnaround there. What happens there at the level of the power plant, who knows to what extent there is capture in the form of corruption there. But everywhere else, has gone worse. The police, most of all, the South African police service, this is a national crisis because the police service cannot be trusted. We don't know which of the cops are corrupt, how corrupt they are. Are they in cahoots with the politicians, with the mafias, with who? I mean, yesterday there was a report of the inspector who were investigating the attempted murder of the vice chancellor of Fort Hare University. He was being paid off by the people he was investigating. So in that sense, that's a kind of capture, if you will. That's gotten worse. The things that really, the geese that have to lay the golden eggs for the capitalist system, they have been kind of, or there's a process or attempts to rehabilitate them. Whether it's fully so, I would be very surprised because of the nature of corruption. It is part of how the politics in South Africa is structured. So, and it's kind of an extractive, corrupt kind of capitalism. So,
And so, William, I hear what the prof says, and I see those exact patterns still in Joburg, but the train to Bosmont is running again. And to Soweto, it's working again. There hasn't been the life depleting load shedding, and those speak to institutional strengthening. So I'll probably be the only person in our little room today who feels like there have been important changes at the NPA as well, and that we misplace functionality of a criminal justice system by reducing it to the shorthand of orange overalls or prosecutions only.
Yeah.
Am I being overly optimistic here, Prof?
Yeah, first, I just have to tell you, I think often citizens do not understand, but if once an institution is captured, it's very difficult to turn around an institution. I mean, whether it's a democratic institution or any other kind of state institution. I mean, normally in the private sector, if a company is captured, it just collapses. And in the state, we keep, of course, we keep the institutions functioning and we pour money into it, and so on, because the institution is important for us as a society. So, but if that institution that has been captured, if it was a private institution, it would have just collapsed. So, so that's the first. And that is why we must fight hard to prevent the capture of institutions, because it takes so many years to turn it around. Secondly, what we now need as a society, and you look at societies that have failed, as often they have sort of post-colonial societies, and they fail because they destroy institutions. So we don't, at the beginning, don't get enough people who build institutions, because it's different capabilities of people. There could be, if you're in a liberation struggle, even in civil society, you sort of protest, you're anti. There's, you're breaking a system, you're against the system. And there are other kinds of people who build institutions, who start institutions, and who build institutions. So we haven't had as many of those people in the state itself, sort of institutional builders. And we need to get more of those kind of people. And that is why merit-based kind of appointments are so important. But coming back to your direct question, yes, we've seen, I think, the last year or so with the Government of National Unity, we've seen some green shoots, some movements where things begin to work. And also, because the private sector and civil society has gotten involved or have been allowed to be involved more since the GNU, we've seen that kind of capacity also coming on board, because often people think state capacity is not just state in a narrow sense, but it's to bring in civil society in the private sector to help where the state cannot deliver. If we can get that understanding of that, and that will help us to get institutions to function quicker. If we can bring in capacity that sits outside the state to get the state to work.
I hear you on that, but please, Pierre, you go.
So yes, and I'm feeling now like the villain for being so negative and cynical. But I think it's important to be realistic and to say, okay, what is working, what is not working, why is it working, why isn't it working? But I want to say something about the prosecuting authority. I agree with you, Cheryl, that there has been improvements. It is incomparable from the leadership there now is a leadership not always brave, but they are not corrupt. They have integrity. They try their best under the circumstances. But there are two things that people, I think, don't understand. If you are in the National Prosecuting Authority, you're the national director. You are independent, but whenever you take on somebody who's really powerful, Jacob Zuma or one of those state capturers, you have a whole system that is working against you. Mm-hmm. And so if you have what we have, namely, yes, an independent national director, but a president who says, let them do their job, not we support this, we will make sure that they have the money, people must be prosecuted. It is like, let us on equal opportunities procrastinator. I'm not going to take sides between the corrupt people and the prosecuting authority. Then it weakens the prosecuting authority. The second thing is, the most important thing is you cannot prosecute if there's not evidence, and you cannot have evidence if the hawks and now the investigative unit in the prosecuting authority, another excellent development, if they find the evidence. So the biggest problem is that we don't have enough people with the necessary skills in the hawks and so on, who actually can investigate. If they have to investigate all the corruption, you would need about 1 million people in the hawks to do so, and they all would have to have degrees in financial accounting and so on. That's not going to happen. Many people.
Shame they often don't even have airtime from what I hear.
And so people think it's only about the national director. Shame. She now sits there and she gets the file from the hawks, and they haven't. The evidence is not there. They have forgotten to check the bank accounts, whatever the case might be. I'm having it up a bit for effect, but
yeah.
And so we have to be realistic. If you want the system to work, you need to put. And yeah, I agree with William, although I don't like that conflict between merit and non-merit. I think you have to put people there who can do the job. And you shouldn't complain in a way, or you should understand that if you are going to insist that people appointment who don't have the skills, or you insist that they shouldn't get the money they require, you are part of the problem, not of the solution.
Got you. So I do want to be the opposite of your villain for just a moment. And look at, so we're not starting from scratch here. We have a number of fine institution builders. So Lesetja Kganyago, Reserve Bank as an institution, excellent. Ed Kiesewette really took back SARS and has pushed through some fundamental changes there. National Treasury as a whole, I think, is often a place that is a hotbed of the kind of institutional independence and expertise you speak about. I know Shamila has done a great job, but there's someone I watch is Omar Abaji Rasataba, the asset forfeiture unit head. 15 billion rand retrieved, either frozen or retrieved for the criminal asset recovery account. That's a phenomenal job. She'll be at the gathering next week to speak to us. And then, of course, Mteto Nyati, the chairperson of Eskom. So we have people who know what to do and how to do the work. We just obviously need, like you say, Pierre, millions of them. So as we rush up to the hour, we've got really lovely questions. So if we can just answer them quite sharply, that would be great. Joe Hayes asked, and William, you can take this one. To what extent does the funding model of institutions like the Public Protector or other Chapter 9 institutions compromise or protect their independence? Finn Taylor asked, is independence in practice possible when appointments are made by Parliament or the executive? So if you could address those two, please.
Yeah. Now, there is, I think, deficiencies in the funding model for some of our democratic oversight institutions, because the executive can always make life difficult from squeeze the funding if an institution is too critical and too competent, and that's what we saw during the Zuma years and so on. And with the NPA, I mean, I've been screaming and shouting for more money. So we have to begin to think how do we get much more sustainable of funding models. Now, on the appointments, I would prefer that executives, when I say executives, that means ministers do not make appointments, and that the appointments either go through an independent process or either through Parliament. But even in the Parliament process, that it becomes an independent process, that we bring in, for example, civil society and so on. That's very important, because right now, the way our system works, the president makes most of the appointments of where there's a CEO of a democratic oversight institution or state-owned entity. I mean, that is just such an anomaly in the system. Whoever, I think, when our constitution, or those who wrote it, if there's a weakness in when they wrote the constitution, is to vest power of appointments in the president and in the executive. And so on. I mean, that's really, so when I'm very reluctant to call for changes in the constitution, but if there's anything that needs to be changed, is to take the power of appointment away from the president and the executive, because that's, because you can capture the president, and then it means you can capture the whole state. Just through.
Should we have processes like how Shamila was? She was appointed by the president, but the interviews were held publicly at Parliament. Similarly, should we have a JSC like we appoint judges? Is that how we should make these critical appointments? Do you think, William?
Absolutely.
First, and then Pierre can come in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I have been myself campaigning for that sort of thing. Obviously, we can't make all appointments like that, but there are key appointments at key institutions. I think that's the lesson from state capture, because what made state capture happen is the power to make appointments, the power to appoint the CEO of ESCOM, the chairman of like one person in the presidency to be able to do that. I mean, in no other system around the world is so vested with that kind of power, unless it's a communist system. And so no democracy anywhere has that kind of power of appointing state entities at all levels and democratic oversight institutions. So I think that is a reform worthwhile to look at.
Then you've been doing that at Democracy Works and elsewhere. Pierre, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, so I can't remember who said this, but that power is about who decides, and about who decides, and then about who decides, who decides, who decides. So who appoints is very important. The problem is that people forget that no matter who makes the appointment, there will be political or ideological or other interests involved. If you have a neutral panel who selects whoever, that panel might be in service of the big business or international capital or the unions or whatever. So just because the president doesn't make the appointment doesn't mean that it is going to be a good appointment or that it's going to be a non-political appointment. So there's no perfect system, but a kind of system through Parliament, especially now that it's a hung Parliament, that there's an open process for the most important positions is obvious, probably the least damaging or the least potentially the least harmful way of doing it.
So, William, just as we wrap, I want to ask a final question and also raise something that Andres Sibanyoni is asking us. Did you see the newly appointed administrators of some SETA bodies today? So anyway, I'll tell it to you quickly if you haven't. The DA's put out a statement saying the Higher Education Minister, Buti Manamela, has appointed administrators to problematic SETAs, but he obviously didn't Google or ChatGPT nicely or use due diligence methods, because all of them have clouds hanging over them. But the bigger question here is, suddenly our parliament is an institution of some muscle. That's how the other dodgy appointments were found out. Is this a moment of hope for us, that Parliament finally doing its job and doing it well? And this will be your opportunity for your last comment as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I'm actually very excited about our parliament. And I know a lot of people say, well, 60, 70% of people, the GNU, the executive is, they're dominant, and only 30% or so are opposition in parliament. But the opposition actually is being much more vibrant and proactive than previous oppositions. So, I mean, I'm very critical of MK, but MK has brought some parliamentarians with some kind of technical skills that also knows how the state function, and they have actually gone out and tried to expose what's happening and so on. And the same with EFF. Actually, they've become, during this session this year so far, I saw them less populistic in parliament and actually more on asking the proper questions that the opposition should be doing. In the past, where the DA, my criticism of the DA when it was in opposition, it was so focused on the lawfare. When you focus on lawfare, the problem with lawfare is you're in the courts, but you're not engaging with society, with the issues of society. That's always the weakness. And the other part of it is the ANC used to criticize it as a white opposition, so then people dismiss it. It's very difficult to say that now of MK, and it's very difficult to say that of EFF. And also because the dynamics of the GNU, it is because the ANC dropped below 50%, almost every party now think of the opportunity they can actually be in national government. It's totally different from where the ANC was so dominant that no one's thought they would ever be there. So there is, I think, a much more. I'm very hopeful. I think it's a very exciting period, because we've got opposition, a more muscular opposition inside parliament, but we also have opposition even in cabinet. So we've got a GNU where partners are partners, but also opposition in and holding each other accountable. And I think that will take us on a good journey.
Thank you, William. So, Pierre, final question for you from Christo Bester, and also to wind up, he reminds us that Sakalecha is in court seeking seeking that, I think it's Ditsabotle, but it's one of those Northwest municipalities be placed under full administration rather than the partial version that, for example, we have in Joburg. And he asked, the question is our constitution able to efficiently deal with the current overall state collapse, or should it even be doing that? And then you can add your final thoughts on where we go.
Okay, so that's actually a really important question, because I think people wrongly believe that a constitution and the legal system can actually fix political dysfunction. What's happening in the municipalities has to do with the business model of the ANC as a mechanism of extracting resources from the state through corruption. The court and even the administration, and no matter what the provisions of the constitution said, it's not going to replace that municipal governance and the voters who voted that government in with another one. We're not living in virtual press lives world. So that means that the constitution can provide guardrails. It can check some of the excesses, but it cannot change the politics. The politics is for us to change through work, through organizing, through protesting, through trying to get political parties to be responsible and to hold them accountable. This is the citizens who have to do the hard work. It's whether it is what chance there is of actually changing the system and changing the political culture. I'm a bit, I hope there is a chance for this, but it is not something that comes from a court judgment. It's through hard work, through struggle, if you will.
Absolutely, through struggle, through organizing, through being an active citizen. So thank you very much, Prof. William Gumede, Prof. Pierre de Vos, for walking so beautifully on the shoulders of Judge Albie Sachs, in whose honor we do this webinar today. And thank you to our audience for really lovely questions. There are quite a few more that I hope we'll be able to get to in future webinars. Please do join us at the gathering next week, August 28th, at the Cape Town Convention Center. You can see about how to book for that on our website. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. That was a lovely discussion.
Thank you.